The strongest people in the room are usually the ones who never feel the need to prove it. The lunch bell echoed through Redwood State Correctional Facility as hundreds of inmates formed long, orderly lines outside the cafeteria, each man carrying the weight of his own story behind tired eyes and quiet expressions. Conversations blended into the familiar soundtrack of metal doors, rolling food carts, and correctional officers giving routine instructions. It looked like an ordinary afternoon, but before the next few minutes were over, almost everyone inside that cafeteria would witness something they would never forget. Marcus Brooks stepped into the serving line without drawing attention to himself. At 39 years old, the black inmate had only arrived at Redwood 3 days earlier. He spoke politely to the kitchen staff, accepted his tray with a grateful nod, and quietly thanked the older inmate serving bread before walking toward an empty table near the far wall. His orange prison jumpsuit looked freshly issued, his boots carefully cleaned despite the dusty prison yard, and his movements carried an unusual calm that seemed almost out of place inside a maximum security prison. While many newcomers nervously scanned every corner of the room, Marcus seemed more interested in appreciating a hot meal than worrying about who might be watching him. Unfortunately, someone was watching. Kyle Mercer sat at the center table surrounded by several white inmates who had followed him for years. Inside Redwood, Kyle had built a reputation that extended far beyond physical size. He controlled conversations with sarcasm, intimidation, and the confidence of someone who believed respect could only come through fear. New inmates often became entertainment during their first week, and today Kyle had already decided who would provide it. He leaned back in his chair, glanced toward Marcus, and smirked before saying loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Looks like somebody forgot to explain how things work around here." A few nervous laughs spread across the cafeteria. Marcus continued walking without looking toward the comment. He reached the empty table, carefully placed his tray down, and quietly folded his hands together for a brief moment before sitting. One correctional officer noticed the gesture and exchanged a puzzled glance with another officer standing near the entrance. Most inmates rushed through meals. Very few paused to appreciate them. Kyle slowly stood from his chair as his friends watched with amused expressions. The entire section seemed to anticipate another familiar scene. He walked directly toward Marcus with exaggerated confidence, while carrying nothing but his own pride. The cafeteria gradually became quieter as nearby conversations faded. Even inmates who claimed not to enjoy drama instinctively turned their heads. Marcus looked up calmly as Kyle stopped beside the table. "That seat belongs to somebody else," Kyle said with a mocking smile. Marcus glanced at the surrounding empty tables before answering in a steady voice. "There seems to be plenty of room for everyone." The response contained neither fear nor defiance. It sounded like simple honesty. Somehow that irritated Kyle even more. He tilted his head, glanced around at the growing audience, and suddenly swung his foot beneath the edge of the table. Marcus's lunch tray slid across the metal surface before tumbling onto the concrete floor. Bread rolled beneath another table. Mashed potatoes spread across the gray surface. The plastic cup spun in slow circles before coming to a stop. Silence instantly replaced every remaining conversation. Several inmates smiled, expecting shouting or retaliation. Others simply watched with tired expressions, having seen similar scenes countless times before. Marcus remained seated. He slowly looked down at the scattered meal without changing his expression. Then, to everyone's surprise, he calmly stood, walked over, picked up the tray piece by piece, and gathered what little food could still be saved. One kitchen worker quietly shook his head with sympathy. Another inmate whispered, "He is either scared or smarter than all of us." Marcus carried the damaged tray back toward the serving counter and spoke politely to the elderly kitchen volunteer. "Thank you for preparing lunch today. I appreciate the work you do." The older man blinked in surprise before quietly offering him another slice of bread that had not yet been served. Marcus accepted it with genuine gratitude. Across the cafeteria, Kyle frowned. That was not the reaction he wanted. Embarrassment usually produced anger. Anger usually produced punishment. Punishment usually confirmed his control. But Marcus had refused to play the role Kyle had written for him. Instead of creating chaos, he had somehow made the entire cafeteria feel strangely uncomfortable. Correctional Officer Daniel Foster had watched the entire exchange from only 20 feet away. He expected paperwork, shouting, or disciplinary action. Instead, he found himself studying Marcus with growing curiosity. Years of working inside Redwood had taught him that genuine self-control was far rarer than physical toughness. As Marcus quietly returned to his seat with nothing more than a piece of bread and a cup of water, dozens of eyes remained fixed on him. Nobody noticed the subtle way he adjusted his balance as he sat down again. Nobody recognized the effortless posture that came from decades of disciplined training. Nobody understood why his breathing never changed, why his shoulders remained relaxed, or why his eyes carried neither resentment nor fear. To everyone inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, Marcus Brooks appeared to be just another quiet black inmate trying to survive another day. They had absolutely no idea that the man eating that simple piece of bread had spent years mastering one of the world's most respected martial arts disciplines, and before long, the entire prison would discover that true strength often reveals itself only after patience has been tested. The unusual silence that settled over the cafeteria lingered long after lunch had ended. As inmates returned their trays and lined up to leave, conversations resumed only in quiet whispers. Almost everyone had witnessed the same moment, yet nobody seemed able to explain why it felt so different from every other confrontation they had seen inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Marcus Brooks walked with the rest of the line, carrying nothing except the empty tray and the same calm expression he had worn since arriving at the prison. He thanked the kitchen worker one last time before placing the tray on the return cart, then joined the line without looking toward Kyle Mercer or the group of white inmates standing nearby. His breathing remained steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his pace unhurried. Walter Hayes, an older inmate who had spent nearly 2 decades inside different correctional facilities, quietly watched Marcus from several places behind. Walter had learned to recognize fear, anger, pride, and desperation simply by observing how men carried themselves after difficult moments. Marcus displayed none of those emotions. Instead, he looked like someone who had already accepted that another person's behavior did not need to determine his own. Walter found that far more interesting than any argument could have been. As the line slowly moved through the security checkpoint, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster continued observing the new inmate with growing curiosity. Foster had expected paperwork after the cafeteria incident. He had expected complaints, raised voices, or at least a request to replace the ruined meal. Instead, Marcus had quietly accepted a piece of bread, thanked the staff, and moved on. During 12 years working inside Redwood, Foster had seen physically strong inmates lose control over far smaller inconveniences. The newcomer's restraint stood out more than any display of toughness. Once the housing unit doors closed behind the returning inmates, the afternoon routine resumed. Marcus entered cell C-214, folded the extra blanket neatly across the lower bunk, washed his hands, and carefully wiped a small layer of dust from the narrow metal shelf beside the window before placing a worn paperback book on top. Everything inside the modest cell was arranged with quiet precision. Nothing appeared excessive, yet nothing looked neglected. After sitting on the edge of the bunk for a few moments, Marcus opened the book and began reading as though the events of lunch belonged to another day. Several cells away, Kyle leaned against the railing outside his second-tier cell while speaking with 2 inmates who regularly followed him. One of them laughed and said he did not even fight back. Kyle looked toward Marcus's cell for several silent seconds before answering. "That is exactly what bothers me." The younger inmate frowned. "Why?" Kyle folded his arms. "Most people react." He did not. Men who stay that calm usually know something the rest of us do not. The words surprised even his closest companions. Kyle rarely admitted uncertainty. For the first time since Marcus arrived, curiosity had begun replacing confidence. Later that afternoon, inmates reported to their assigned work details. Marcus received a temporary assignment inside the prison library. The quiet room stood in sharp contrast to the noise of the housing unit. Rows of aging books filled sturdy shelves while sunlight filtered through reinforced windows high along the walls. Library Supervisor Ellen Brooks handed Marcus a card of returned books and thanked him for helping organize the collection. Marcus smiled politely, accepted the task without complaint, and immediately began arranging each book carefully according to its proper location. He handled every worn volume with the same respect he had shown the kitchen workers earlier. Ellen noticed the attention to detail and quietly remarked to another staff member, "He treats every book like it matters." Across the room, Walter entered the library to exchange a history novel and smiled when he saw Marcus working. "Looks like they gave you one of the better jobs," he said. Marcus placed another book onto the shelf before answering. "Every honest job deserves the same effort." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "You always see things differently." Marcus gave a small smile. "Different perspectives make life easier." Before Walter could reply, the library door opened again. Cal stepped inside under the pretense of browsing for a book, but his eyes quickly settled on Marcus. He wandered slowly between the shelves, occasionally glancing toward the quiet black inmate, who continued organizing books without showing the slightest sign of discomfort. The silence inside the library somehow felt heavier than the cafeteria had earlier that day. Cal finally stopped several feet away and asked, "You really enjoy this?" Marcus looked at the shelf he had just finished organizing before meeting Kyle's eyes. "I enjoy leaving places a little better than I found them." Kyle searched his face for sarcasm, but found none. The answer sounded completely sincere. For reasons he could not explain, that simple sentence stayed with him long after he walked out of the library. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster watched through the observation window and quietly wondered how one man could change the atmosphere of every room he entered without raising his voice, making a threat, or asking anyone for respect. Inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, that mystery was only beginning to unfold. The following morning began with the familiar sound of steel doors unlocking throughout Cell Block C as another ordinary day unfolded inside Redwood State Correctional Facility. Yet nothing felt quite as ordinary as it had before Marcus Brooks arrived. Without realizing it, many inmates had started measuring their own behavior against the quiet discipline of the new black inmate. Marcus stepped into the corridor wearing the same neatly pressed orange prison jumpsuit, carrying a paperback book beneath one arm as he joined the line for breakfast. He greeted Correctional Officer Daniel Foster with a respectful nod before taking his place without attempting to move ahead of anyone else. Around him, conversations continued, but several inmates quietly glanced in his direction before returning to their own discussions. Walter Hayes noticed the subtle change immediately. Respect inside prison usually came from reputation or intimidation. Marcus had earned it simply by remaining consistent. Walter walked beside him as the line moved slowly toward the cafeteria. "People are talking about you again," Walter said with a faint smile. Marcus looked ahead calmly. "People usually become curious before they understand." Walter chuckled softly. "You really believe understanding matters that much?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Most problems begin when people stop trying to understand each other." The answer lingered in Walter's mind as they entered the cafeteria. Breakfast passed. Quietly, Marcus thanked the kitchen staff, carried his tray to an empty table, and ate without rushing. Unlike the previous afternoon, nobody interrupted him. Kyle Mercer sat several tables away surrounded by the same group of white inmates. But instead of immediately creating another confrontation, he simply watched. The confidence that once fueled every decision had gradually been replaced by curiosity. He found himself studying Marcus's posture, the way he carefully arranged his tray, and the relaxed rhythm of every movement. Nothing appeared forced. Everything looked practiced. After breakfast, inmates reported to their daily assignments. Marcus returned to the prison library where Supervisor Ellen Brooks handed him another cart filled with returned books. He thanked her warmly and immediately began sorting the collection by category. While placing several biographies onto a shelf, Marcus noticed an elderly inmate struggling to reach the highest row of books. Without drawing attention to himself, he calmly stepped forward, accepted the stack with a polite smile, placed each volume neatly into position, and returned the empty cart without expecting thanks. The older inmate quietly nodded in appreciation. Ellen watched the entire exchange from behind the circulation desk. "You always notice when someone needs help," she remarked. Marcus smiled gently. "Sometimes people only need someone paying attention." Ellen shook her head with quiet admiration before returning to her paperwork. Later that afternoon, the recreation period began beneath bright sunshine. Marcus carried his paperback to the familiar maple tree near the edge of the yard, while Walter completed several laps around the walking track. Correctional Officer Foster continued his routine patrol, occasionally looking toward Marcus out of professional curiosity. Across the yard, Kyle stood with two companions near the basketball court. One of them pointed toward Marcus and asked, "Are you finally done worrying about the new guy?" Kyle did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Marcus help another inmate retrieve several scattered library books that had accidentally slipped from a small cart being transported across the yard. Marcus bent smoothly, gathered each book carefully, handed them back with a friendly smile, and continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. "He notices everything," Kyle finally said. "He moves like somebody who already knows where everyone is before they get there." His companions exchanged uncertain glances. They had begun noticing the same thing, but had never spoken about it aloud. Nearby, Officer Foster observed the brief moment from another angle. Once again, Marcus moved with remarkable balance and economy, never rushing, never overreaching, never wasting motion. Foster quietly remembered a conversation years earlier with a volunteer martial arts instructor who had explained that disciplined practitioners eventually carried their training into ordinary life, making even the simplest actions appear calm and efficient. The memory stayed with him as recreation ended. That evening, after final count, Foster reviewed routine inmate information available through the prison record system. He was not searching for misconduct. He simply wanted to understand why Marcus carried himself differently from almost everyone else inside Redwood. Although the detailed rehabilitation records required additional authorization, one publicly available entry caught his attention. Years before his incarceration, Marcus had volunteered extensively in community athletic programs centered on discipline, mentorship, and Jiu-Jitsu instruction. Foster leaned back quietly, saying nothing to anyone. Suddenly, the newcomer's extraordinary patience, effortless balance, and unwavering self-control seemed far less mysterious. They were not talents discovered overnight. They were habits shaped by years of disciplined training and reinforced through countless ordinary choices. Meanwhile, inside cell C-214, Marcus closed his paperback, placed it carefully beside his neatly folded blanket, and looked through the narrow window toward the fading evening light. Beyond the prison walls, another sunset disappeared across the horizon. Inside Redwood, however, a different realization had only just begun to rise. More people were starting to understand that the quiet man they had mistaken for weakness possessed a strength that had never depended on fear, reputation, or force, and that understanding would soon change far more than anyone expected. The next several days quietly confirmed what many inmates had already begun to suspect. Marcus Brooks never changed, regardless of where he was or who stood in front of him. Whether he was carrying books through the library, waiting patiently in the meal line, or sitting beneath the familiar maple tree during recreation, he moved with the same calm confidence that never demanded attention yet somehow attracted it anyway. Inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, consistency was rare, and that alone made Marcus different. Kyle Mercer found the difference increasingly difficult to ignore. Every morning he expected the quiet black inmate to finally lose patience. Every afternoon he searched for a weakness that would explain the newcomer's unusual composure. Every evening he returned to his cell with more questions than answers. During breakfast one morning, Marcus quietly thanked the kitchen workers before taking his tray toward an empty table. As he passed another inmate carrying a cup of milk, the man accidentally stumbled after catching his foot against a chair leg. Before the tray could slip from his hands, Marcus calmly stepped sideways, gently steadied the edge of the tray with one hand, and helped the inmate regain his balance without spilling the meal. The movement lasted less than a second. It was smooth, economical, and almost impossible to notice unless someone happened to be watching closely. Walter Hayes noticed. Correctional Officer Daniel Foster noticed. Kyle noticed as well. Marcus simply smiled at the surprised inmate and continued walking toward his table as though nothing unusual had happened. Walter joined him several minutes later and quietly asked, "Do things like that happen around you often?" Marcus smiled faintly before taking a sip of water. "People lose balance sometimes. If I can help, I help." Walter leaned back thoughtfully. "You never seem surprised." Marcus answered gently. Preparation makes ordinary moments feel less surprising. Those simple words stayed with Walter long after breakfast ended. Later that morning, Marcus returned to the prison library where Ellen Brooks assigned him to organize several shelves containing donated biographies and history books. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities Marcus possessed in abundance. While arranging the final row, he noticed a loose shelf bracket beginning to tilt under the weight of several heavy books. Rather than ignoring it, he quietly informed Ellen before carefully removing the books one by one so maintenance could safely repair it later. Ellen smiled appreciatively. Most people would have walked past it. Marcus placed another book onto the cart before replying. Small problems become larger when nobody notices them. Across the room, Kyle entered the library carrying a borrowed novel he had little intention of reading. His real purpose was to observe Marcus again. Standing near one of the shelves, he watched the quiet inmate interact with staff, fellow inmates, and everyone who entered the room. Marcus treated every person with exactly the same respect. There was no change in his voice when speaking to officers. There was no change when speaking to inmates. Kyle had spent years believing respect depended on status. Marcus behaved as though respect should be offered first and judged later. That idea felt unfamiliar. During afternoon recreation, several inmates gathered near the walking track, while others played basketball beneath the bright summer sun. Marcus settled beneath the maple tree with another paperback, enjoying the peaceful corner of the yard that had slowly become his daily routine. Walter approached carrying 2 bottles of water distributed by the recreation staff and handed one to Marcus. "Looks like this has become your office," Walter joked. Marcus laughed softly. "It is a nice place to read." Nearby, Kyle stood watching from the opposite side of the yard. One of the younger inmates beside him quietly asked, "Are you going to test him again?" Kyle remained silent for several moments before answering, "No, I think I have been asking the wrong questions." The younger inmate looked confused. "What do you mean?" Kyle kept his eyes on Marcus. "I wanted to know whether he was weak. Now I want to know how someone becomes that calm." At that moment, a recreation coordinator carrying several lightweight exercise mats accidentally dropped one near the walking path. Marcus immediately stepped forward, picked it up, brushed away the dust, and handed it back with a warm smile. The coordinator thanked him before continuing across the yard. Officer Foster watched the exchange from nearby and quietly realized that Marcus never waited for recognition before doing the right thing. He simply acted because it reflected the person he had chosen to become. As the afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the recreation yard, Foster found himself thinking again about the rehabilitation record mentioning years of jiu-jitsu instruction. Suddenly, every graceful movement, every perfectly balanced step, and every calm response made complete sense. Marcus was not trying to hide his past. He simply refused to let it become the most important thing about him. Unknown to Marcus, that quiet decision was beginning to influence people far more deeply than any demonstration of skill ever could. And inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, respect was slowly replacing assumption one ordinary moment at a time. By the beginning of the second week, life inside Redwood State Correctional Facility continued according to its familiar schedule, yet something subtle had changed throughout Cell Block C. Marcus Brooks no longer attracted attention because he was the newest inmate. Instead, people watched him because every ordinary moment seemed to reveal another small piece of a character they could not easily explain. He remained the first to thank the kitchen staff, the last to leave unnecessary work unfinished, and the one person who never appeared rushed, frustrated, or distracted by the constant tension surrounding prison life. During the afternoon recreation period, warm sunlight stretched across the concrete yard as inmates gathered near the basketball court, the walking track, and the shaded benches beneath the large maple tree. Marcus carried another paperback book under one arm and quietly made his way toward the familiar bench where he usually spent his free time reading. Walter Hayes greeted him with an easy smile before continuing his daily walk around the track. Correctional Officer Daniel Foster observed the recreation yard from a nearby walkway, making routine notes while quietly watching the interactions between inmates. Across the yard, Kyle Mercer leaned against the fence speaking with 2 members of his group, but his attention repeatedly drifted toward Marcus. One of the younger inmates noticed. "You still think he is hiding something?" he asked. Kyle answered without taking his eyes off Marcus. "I do not think he is hiding anything anymore. I think we simply never understood what we were looking at." The younger inmate looked puzzled, but before he could ask another question, an unexpected commotion interrupted several conversations nearby. A recreation staff member pushing a cart loaded with lightweight exercise equipment accidentally rolled over a small crack in the pavement. One stack of foam training pads slid sideways, while another cart carrying water bottles shifted slightly toward a narrow walkway crowded with inmates. Several people instinctively stepped backward to avoid getting in the way. Marcus reacted differently. Without rushing, he calmly moved one step to the side, gently steadied the edge of the cart with one hand, and guided one of the loose pads away from the wheels before it created a larger problem. His movement flowed naturally into the next without hesitation, allowing the staff member to regain complete control of the cart almost immediately. The entire moment lasted no more than a second. There was no dramatic display, no unnecessary speed, and no wasted motion. Everything appeared balanced, efficient, and remarkably precise. The recreation staff member smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you. That could have become a real mess." Marcus returned the foam pad with a polite nod. "I am glad everything worked out." He then picked up his book and quietly continued toward the maple tree as though nothing unusual had happened. Walter had watched the entire exchange from only a few yards away. "That was impressive," he said after joining Marcus beneath the tree. Marcus opened his book before replying. "It was only good timing." Walter smiled knowingly. "No, good timing comes from practice." Marcus looked up briefly and returned the smile without answering. Nearby, Officer Foster replayed the scene in his mind. Once again, Marcus had solved a problem through balance, awareness, and precise movement instead of urgency. Foster remembered the notation in the rehabilitation records referencing years of jiu-jitsu instruction. Suddenly, the connection felt impossible to ignore. The discipline Marcus displayed every day was no accident. It had been shaped over years of deliberate training until calm reactions had become second nature. Kyle slowly walked across the recreation yard alone. For the first time since Marcus arrived, there was no trace of arrogance in his expression. He stopped beside the bench, leaving several feet of respectful distance between them. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. Marcus closed the book and looked up. "Of course." Kyle hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The way you moved just now, that was not luck, was it?" Marcus answered honestly. "No, it was something I practiced for many years." Kyle folded his arms thoughtfully. "Jiu-Jitsu?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes." There was no pride in his voice, only simple truth. Kyle remained silent for several seconds before asking one final question. "Then why did you never tell anyone?" Marcus looked toward the recreation yard where dozens of inmates continued their afternoon activities beneath the bright sky. "Because character should introduce a person long before accomplishments do." The words settled over the quiet corner of the yard with unexpected weight. Walter lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Officer Foster, standing several yards away, quietly understood that the greatest lesson Marcus had brought into Redwood had never been about martial arts. It was about humility. Around the recreation yard, ordinary conversations gradually resumed, but for Kyle Mercer, everything had changed. He finally understood that the quiet black inmate everyone had underestimated had never needed to prove his strength because he had spent years mastering something far more difficult than winning a competition. He had mastered himself. The conversation beneath the maple tree quietly spread throughout Redwood State Correctional Facility long before the afternoon recreation period came to an end. Nobody claimed Marcus Brooks had boasted about his accomplishments. In fact, the opposite became the story repeated from one housing unit to another. The quiet black inmate had admitted years of jiu-jitsu training only after someone asked directly, and even then he had spoken about discipline instead of victories. That simple humility left a deeper impression than any dramatic display ever could. As inmates returned to their assigned areas, Walter Hayes walked beside Marcus with a thoughtful smile. "You know everyone is going to talk about that conversation," Walter said. Marcus adjusted the paperback book beneath his arm before answering. "People are free to talk." Walter looked at him curiously. "Does it not bother you?" Marcus shook his head. "I cannot choose what other people say. I can only choose how I live." Walter quietly laughed. "You always make difficult things sound simple." Marcus smiled warmly. "Simple does not always mean easy." Behind them, Kyle Mercer walked several steps farther back than usual. For the first time since Marcus had entered Redwood, he no longer felt the need to lead every conversation around him. Instead, he found himself replaying Marcus's words again and again. Character should introduce a person long before accomplishments do. The sentence challenged everything Kyle had believed for years. He had spent most of his time inside prison trying to build a reputation people would fear. Marcus had built respect without ever trying to build a reputation at all. Later that evening, Correctional Officer Daniel Foster completed routine paperwork inside the administrative office before speaking briefly with Recreation Coordinator Melissa Grant. "The new inmate in cell block C," Foster said. "Did he ever mention martial arts to you?" Melissa smiled. "Only after I thanked him for helping with the equipment yesterday. He said balance becomes useful in ordinary life." Foster nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like him." Melissa looked toward the recreation yard through the office window. "Most people spend years trying to convince others they are strong. He seems more interested in helping people feel safe." Foster quietly agreed. Inside the housing unit, Marcus returned another finished novel to the library cart before selecting a biography recommended by Ellen Brooks. As he walked toward his cell, several inmates greeted him with respectful nods. Marcus acknowledged each one with the same calm courtesy, never treating anyone differently because of what had happened over the previous week. Walter noticed the consistency once again. Whether someone had ignored Marcus, doubted him, or respected him, his response never changed. That steadiness became the quality people admired most. The following afternoon, the recreation department announced a voluntary wellness activity focused on stretching, breathing, and posture. Participation was open to anyone interested. Because several staff members had already noticed Marcus's exceptional discipline and calm demeanor, Recreation Coordinator Melissa Grant approached him privately before the session began. "Would you be willing to help demonstrate a few simple balance exercises?" she asked. Marcus paused briefly before answering. "Only if everyone practices together. I do not want anyone feeling singled out." Melissa smiled. "That is exactly why I asked you." Word spread quickly across the recreation yard. Some inmates arrived expecting to see an athletic demonstration. Instead, Marcus stood wearing the same orange prison jumpsuit as everyone else and quietly explained that good balance began with patience, steady breathing, and paying attention to the present moment. He demonstrated simple movements suitable for anyone regardless of age or physical ability. There were no dramatic techniques, no competition, and no attempt to impress the crowd. Walter followed each exercise with genuine interest. Several older inmates appreciated how accessible the movements felt. Even Correctional Officer Foster quietly observed from the edge of the yard, recognizing that Marcus spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years teaching rather than showing off. To everyone's surprise, Kyle joined the group without hesitation. He stood near the back, carefully following each movement with complete concentration. When the session ended, inmates slowly returned the exercise mats while thanking Melissa for organizing the activity. Kyle remained behind until most people had walked away. He approached Marcus with an expression very different from the one he wore on the day of the cafeteria incident. "I have been thinking about something," Kyle admitted. Marcus looked at him attentively. "What is that?" Kyle glanced across the quiet recreation yard before answering. "I used to believe respect came from making sure nobody challenged me. Watching you these past days made me realize respect lasts much longer when people choose to give it." Marcus offered a sincere smile. "Every day gives us another chance to choose differently." Kyle nodded slowly. "I think I finally understand." As the evening sun settled behind the tall security fences, long shadows stretched across the recreation yard where the simple wellness session had just ended. There had been no applause, no trophies, and no dramatic speeches. Yet something meaningful had happened all the same. One quiet man had reminded an entire housing unit that the greatest victories were rarely the loudest ones. They were found in patience, humility, consistency, and the courage to let character speak before reputation ever had the opportunity. Another week quietly passed inside Redwood State Correctional Facility, and the story that continued spreading through the housing units no longer focused on what Marcus Brooks had accomplished before prison. Instead, people talked about how consistently he carried himself every single day. He arrived early for every assignment, treated correctional officers and inmates with equal courtesy, returned library books in perfect condition, and never sought attention for any of it. The more people observed him, the more they realized his greatest discipline had very little to do with Jiu-Jitsu. It was the discipline of character. During breakfast one morning, Marcus accepted his tray with a grateful smile and thanked the kitchen workers as he always did. The same elderly volunteer who had quietly offered him an extra piece of bread after his first difficult lunch recognized him immediately. "Looks like things are getting easier," the older man said. Marcus smiled warmly. "People usually become kinder once they understand each other." The volunteer nodded thoughtfully before serving the next tray. Nearby, Walter Hayes watched the exchange with quiet appreciation. He had spent years believing prison changed everyone for the worse. Yet Marcus somehow continued proving that one person's daily choices could influence an entire environment. After breakfast, Marcus returned to the library where Ellen Brooks greeted him with another card of donated books waiting to be organized. She handed him a small note from the prison education office thanking him for volunteering during the wellness session the previous afternoon. Marcus read it, smiled politely, and folded it into the pages of his paperback without another word. Ellen noticed. "Most people would frame that if they could," she joked. Marcus carefully placed another book onto the shelf before answering. "Doing something meaningful is more important than being recognized for doing it." Ellen laughed softly. "You really believe that, do not you?" Marcus nodded once. "Recognition fades. Habits stay." Meanwhile, Kyle Mercer experienced a different kind of routine. For the first time since arriving at Redwood years earlier, he no longer felt compelled to dominate every conversation around him. Instead, he spent more time observing than speaking. Several inmates who had once followed him without question began noticing the change. One afternoon, a younger inmate asked, "Why did you stop challenging the new guy?" Kyle looked toward the recreation yard where Marcus quietly helped stack library carts before recreation began. "Because I finally realized he was never competing with me," Kyle answered. "I was competing with someone who had already learned the lesson I still needed." The younger inmate remained silent, uncertain how to respond. During recreation, Marcus settled beneath the familiar maple tree with another biography while Walter completed his usual walk around the track. Correctional Officer Daniel Foster watched from a distance as inmates naturally greeted Marcus while passing by. None of them interrupted his reading for long. A brief nod, a polite greeting, or a simple thank you seemed enough. Foster quietly realized that respect had developed around Marcus without rules, demands, or intimidation. It had simply grown through consistency. A short time later, Recreation Coordinator Melissa Grant approached Marcus carrying several folded wellness mats. "We are planning another session next week," she said. "Would you be willing to help again?" Marcus considered the question before replying. "If it helps people, I would be happy to." Melissa smiled appreciatively. "It already has." As she walked away, Kyle slowly approached the bench, stopping at the same respectful distance he had maintained since their conversation beneath the maple tree. "I have been thinking about something else," he said quietly. Marcus closed his book and gave him his full attention. "Go ahead." Kyle looked across the recreation yard before speaking. "When I kicked your lunch tray across the cafeteria, I wanted everyone to see you lose your temper." Marcus listened without interrupting. Kyle continued. "Instead, I ended up seeing my own." The words hung in the quiet afternoon air. Marcus answered gently. "Sometimes the hardest person to understand is ourselves." Kyle gave a slow nod. "I spent years blaming other people for the person I had become." Marcus looked toward the tall security fence surrounding the yard before replying. "The past explains us. It does not have to control us." Walter, walking nearby, heard the final sentence and quietly smiled. Officer Foster heard it as well, making no effort to interrupt the conversation. Around them, inmates continued their ordinary recreation activities while the afternoon sun slowly descended toward the western horizon. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments erupted. No one raised a voice. Yet those simple words carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. Inside Redwood, as autumn gradually approached, cooler mornings settled over Redwood State Correctional Facility, bringing a quieter rhythm to the recreation yard and the housing units. Weeks had passed since Marcus Brooks first entered the prison carrying nothing more than a small duffel bag, a calm expression, and years of quiet discipline that nobody could see. Now the atmosphere around him had changed completely. Men who had once ignored him greeted him with respectful nods. Correctional officers recognized his consistency. Even staff members from different departments occasionally stopped to thank him for helping with educational activities or wellness sessions. Marcus accepted every kind word with the same humble smile before returning his attention to whatever task stood in front of him. One Monday morning, Recreation Coordinator Melissa Grant approached Officer Daniel Foster while reviewing the schedule for inmate programs. "Participation in the wellness sessions has doubled since Marcus began helping," she said. Foster looked across the yard where Marcus was quietly arranging exercise mats before the group arrived. "People trust him," Foster replied. Melissa nodded. "Not because he tells them to. Because he shows them what discipline looks like." Foster smiled thoughtfully. "That kind of leadership cannot be assigned. It has to be earned." Nearby, Walter Hayes listened while preparing several folding chairs for older inmates who preferred seated stretching exercises. He remembered the day Marcus had first entered the cafeteria with a simple lunch tray and how quickly everyone had judged him without understanding who he really was. Looking around the recreation yard now, Walter realized that the greatest surprise had never been Marcus's martial arts background. The true surprise was discovering how much influence quiet integrity could have inside a place where people expected only conflict. As participants slowly gathered beneath the large maple tree, Marcus welcomed everyone with the same relaxed tone he always used. He reminded the group that balance was not only something practiced with the body, but also something developed through daily decisions. He encouraged everyone to move comfortably within their own ability and emphasized patience over perfection. The session remained simple, focusing on breathing, posture, flexibility, and awareness. There were no complicated demonstrations and no attempt to impress anyone. Yet each movement reflected years of disciplined training expressed through humility instead of performance. Kyle Mercer stood among the participants near the middle of the group. Weeks earlier, he would never have imagined voluntarily joining an activity led by the quiet black inmate he had once tried to embarrass. Now he carefully followed every instruction, concentrating on improving himself instead of comparing himself with anyone else. During a short break, one younger inmate quietly asked Kyle, "What made you change?" Kyle looked toward Marcus, who was helping an older participant adjust his posture with patience and respect. "Watching someone live the same values every single day," Kyle answered. "Eventually you stop doubting the person and start questioning yourself." The younger inmate slowly nodded as though hearing something entirely new. After the session concluded, several inmates remained behind to help collect the mats without being asked. Melissa thanked everyone for volunteering, but she noticed something remarkable. Nobody hurried away. Small conversations filled the recreation yard as men who rarely spoke to one another exchanged encouragement and quiet laughter. Foster watched from the security walkway, recognizing that the atmosphere inside the yard felt noticeably different from only a few weeks earlier. Respect had become more visible than tension. Cooperation appeared more often than suspicion. Marcus carried a stack of folded mats toward the storage room when Foster approached him. "You have made quite an impact," the officer remarked. Marcus paused politely before answering. "Everyone here deserves opportunities to become a better version of themselves." Foster folded his arms thoughtfully. "You really believe people can change?" Marcus smiled gently. "I believe people can choose differently, one decision at a time." Foster reflected on Kyle's transformation over recent weeks and quietly realized he had already witnessed proof of those words. Later that evening, as the housing units settled into their normal routine, Walter joined Marcus outside their cells for a few quiet minutes before final count. "When you first arrived," Walter admitted, "I thought your greatest strength would turn out to be martial arts." Marcus looked down the corridor where inmates quietly prepared for another night. "And now?" Walter asked. Marcus answered with a peaceful smile. "Now I hope people remember something much simpler. Skills may earn admiration, but character earns trust." Walter nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. Across the upper tier, Kyle overheard the final sentence and quietly lowered his head in reflection. He realized that the strongest lesson he had learned inside Redwood had never come from watching someone demonstrate extraordinary ability. It had come from watching someone refuse to let bitterness define who he became. As the lights gradually dimmed throughout cell block C and another ordinary day came to a close, the prison felt subtly different from the place Marcus had entered weeks earlier. The walls remained the same. The schedules remained the same. Yet the people inside had begun changing in ways no rulebook could ever require, all because one quiet man had chosen patience over pride, dignity over resentment, and character over reputation every single day. Several months had passed since Marcus Brooks quietly walked into Redwood State Correctional Facility carrying nothing except a small duffel bag, an orange prison jumpsuit, and a lifetime of discipline that nobody could see. Looking around the recreation yard now, it was difficult to believe he had once been viewed as just another inmate destined to become someone else's target. The routines of the prison had not changed. Steel doors still opened before sunrise. Meal lines still stretched across the cafeteria. Count times still interrupted every day with practiced precision. Yet the people living inside those walls had changed in ways that were impossible to measure with rules or reports. Marcus continued following the same quiet routine that had defined every day since his arrival. He thanked the kitchen staff before every meal. He volunteered whenever educational programs needed assistance. He spent afternoons reading beneath the maple tree whenever recreation allowed. He never reminded anyone that he had spent years mastering jiu-jitsu because he believed his daily choices mattered far more than his past accomplishments. Walter Hayes often smiled whenever he watched newer inmates approach Marcus with questions about prison life, discipline, or simply how to remain hopeful during difficult seasons. Marcus never pretended to have every answer. Instead, he listened carefully before offering thoughtful encouragement rooted in patience and personal responsibility. Walter quietly realized that Marcus had become something rare inside Redwood. He had become someone people trusted without ever asking for their trust. Recreation Coordinator Melissa Grant later remarked to Officer Daniel Foster that inmate participation in educational and wellness activities had reached its highest level in years. Foster looked across the yard where Marcus patiently demonstrated another series of simple stretching exercises while several older inmates followed along at their own pace. People are not following him because he was a champion, Foster said thoughtfully. They are following him because he treats every person with respect. Melissa nodded in agreement. That is the kind of influence every institution hopes to see. Nearby, Kyle Mercer waited until the session had ended before approaching Marcus. His expression no longer reflected pride or resentment. Instead, it carried quiet gratitude. I wanted to thank you, Kyle said sincerely. Marcus looked at him with the same calm kindness he had always shown. For what? Kyle smiled faintly. For giving me the opportunity to become someone different without making me feel ashamed of who I used to be. Marcus considered the words before answering. Every person deserves the chance to write a better next chapter. Kyle lowered his head thoughtfully. I used to believe strength meant proving I was better than someone else. Marcus gently shook his head. Real strength begins when we stop measuring ourselves against other people and start becoming better than we were yesterday. Kyle extended his hand. Marcus accepted it without hesitation. Around them, several inmates quietly witnessed the simple exchange. There were no dramatic speeches, no applause, and no celebration. There was only a sincere moment of mutual respect that reflected how far both men had come since that unforgettable afternoon in the cafeteria. Walter watched from beneath the maple tree with a quiet smile. Officer Foster observed from the security walkway before making one final note in his daily report. It contained nothing about conflict, discipline, or misconduct. Instead, it simply documented another successful wellness program and positive inmate participation. Sometimes the most meaningful victories left no dramatic record because they appeared in ordinary moments shared between ordinary people. As evenings settled across Redwood State Correctional Facility, the final recreation period came to an end. Inmates slowly returned to their housing units while golden sunlight faded behind the security fences. Marcus paused for a brief moment beside the maple tree before walking back inside with the same steady pace he had carried since the day he arrived. He had never sought recognition. He had never demanded respect. He had simply chosen, one day after another, to live according to principles that remained unchanged regardless of circumstance. That consistency quietly transformed the people around him. Months earlier, many inmates remembered only the image of a lunch tray sliding across a cafeteria floor. Now they remembered something far more important. They remembered the man who calmly picked it up, thanked the kitchen worker, and refused to allow another person's anger to determine his own character. Long after names, titles, and accomplishments faded from memory, that simple decision continued shaping lives throughout Redwood. In the end, Marcus Brooks reminded everyone who crossed his path that the strongest person in any room is rarely the loudest one. True strength is revealed through patience when provoked, humility when recognized, discipline when nobody is watching, and compassion when others least expect it. Those lessons reached far beyond prison walls because they belonged wherever people chose character over pride, respect over resentment, and quiet integrity over the need to prove themselves. That was the legacy Marcus left inside Redwood, and it became the story people would continue telling long after the final count was completed and another ordinary day quietly came to an end.